Good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Dr. Director of ARK at the University of Ulster, and we're very pleased to welcome you here on such a beautiful sunny morning to the Belfast campus. Those of you who arrived a little bit early may have noticed we have our end of the year displays happening in the corridor. You might want to look at that later on perhaps. But we're very pleased that you're here to join us for this seminar. Professor Hugh McKenna, who's the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation at the University, is just going to say a few words of welcome and then we'll move on to the main business.
Thank you, Gillian. Ladies and gentlemen, students, colleagues, distinguished guests, this is a fantastic morning. Thank you very much for coming along. It's my pleasure and indeed privilege to welcome you to this ARK Seminar here at Belfast campus. ARK, as many of you would be aware, was established in the year 2000 by researchers in the University of Ulster working in collaboration with colleagues in Queen's University of Belfast. In the intervening years, it has increasingly been recognised as a major contribution to social research and outreach. It has led the way and indeed shown the way in opening up access to social and political materials. Perhaps it's best known for its suite of attitudinal surveys emanating from CAIN and indeed the ARK Policy Unit. Because of these, the quality of research, its accessibility, its dissemination and outreach has had a major impact and indeed fed into a number of very major social and political debates. The information that ARK provides is not only of tremendous use to academic staff, but it also has tremendous use for policymakers, for those who work in the voluntary and community sectors. And here at Ulster, a number of researchers from quite a range of disciplines have been working with the research teams. Indeed, from my position as PVC, Research and Innovation, I can see that the research being undertaken as a result of that collaboration not only has impact locally, but also regionally, nationally and internationally. So, why are we here today? This seminar is an excellent example of ARK's work. ARK has been involved in monitoring political attitudes from 1998 and maybe beyond, so over 15 years. It's also always ensured that the data are freely available, which is really important. 2 years ago, there was considerable public and indeed media interest in some of the political attitudinal findings. So to help facilitate the debate around the latest 2012 data, ARK has invited two leading political scientists, Dr Morrow from the University of Ulster and Wilford from Queen's University, and they're going to take us through the headline findings. I think we all would agree that Northern Ireland is a society in transition from years of conflicts. So it's really important to know how these political attitudes are changing, what affects them, and indeed how they affect going forward in terms of political future. I know you're in for a treat, and I'm really pleased you're able to join us this morning, and thank you very much for supporting our work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and it's tremendous when the senior officers are supportive of the research that's going on in the different units of the university, so we welcome your presence. Thank you. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Can you please put your phones off or on silent? That would be great. And we are recording the seminar today for putting up on the ARK website at the end of the day, so just to make you aware that that's happening. We're not aware of any fire alarm tests, so if the fire alarm should go off, then we will have to follow the procedures. In terms of the format for today, I'm just going to say a few words about the survey in general first, before handing over to our experts. And 2 years ago, I don't know if you can see this is a collage of press cuttings, but 2 years ago when the 2010 Life and Times results became available, some of the political parties and some of the media journalists picked up on some of the findings, and there was a huge furore in the press around the future for Northern Ireland and changes in terms of what people were seeing as the best way forward. So we decided this year with the 2012 survey to be a bit more proactive and actually invite some of our leading commentators in Northern Ireland to engage with the findings at an early stage and feed into the more public debate, and that's the intention behind the seminar today. But it might be helpful. Some of you know the survey well, I know, so I'll just be very brief. But the Life and Times survey began in 1998 and has run every year since then, apart from 2011 when we were unfortunately unable to secure funding in time to run the survey. So that we've now had a 2-year gap, 2010 and 2012, findings being presented today. The purpose of the survey is to monitor the attitudes and behaviour of people in Northern Ireland. So we have built an extensive and unique time series of data, which I think Northern Ireland as a region is unique in being able to put together a data set like that that has such value in terms of trying to monitor a society in transition. The survey also builds on an earlier survey, the Northern Ireland Social Attitudes Survey, so as Hugh said, not only do we have the time series since '98 with Life and Times, some of the questions that we'll be reporting on today have actually been asked since 1989. So we have over 20 years of data, and that is a very interesting time series to hold. The survey runs in a modular format. And in 2012, the survey sampled or had a response of 1,204 people, 18 years or over, across Northern Ireland, just a random sample. And the survey contained modules of questions on autism, minority ethnic people, migrant workers, asylum seekers, community relations, lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender issues, and political attitudes. And some of you may have noticed that there was some press coverage earlier in the week around the findings to autism. And over the next number of months, we'll be engaging with the different modules and disseminating from them over the next few months. So from Tuesday, when the data went live, what you can get in relation to Life and Times is the questionnaires, the technical reports, the tables of results by the overall figures, by age, by gender, and by religion. The data sets are all there, freely available to download. And there's also a technical helpline, and Paula Devine, who leads the Life and Times survey, is the person at the end of that helpline and is always willing to assist if people are having any difficulties with the data. We also, over the years, have been putting the data together in time series tables on our surveys online section of the website. So instead of you having to go into the data year on year and look at the figures, it's actually all available there for you in very now lengthy tables which show you the key findings on SOL. So that's all available, publicly available there now. And finally, what I wanted to just say to you is that coming soon will be some new teaching resources. I know some people in the room are lecturing staff and working in various institutions. So there will be some new teaching resources drawing on Life and Times and on the Young Life and Times surveys, teaching data sets, technical reports, teaching guidelines, and so on. So if any of you are interested in that, our colleague Emma Calvert at the School of Sociology, Social Policy and Social Work at Queen's is leading that work with Paula Devine, Deputy Director of ARK. So the material's all there, and now we'll move on to the main business of what you're interested in and what drew you to the event today. The analysis and discussion around the political attitudes and attitudes to our constitutional future. And we were delighted when we approached two leading experts to work with us in preparation for this seminar. First is Dr Morrow, my colleague from the School of Criminology, Politics and Social Policy at the University of Ulster. Duncan's well known to many, not just in his academic position, but for a number of years he was Chief Executive of the Community Relations Council and is very well known speaking on all of these issues. So we're delighted that Duncan, who is very familiar with the data, has agreed to present the findings initially. And then Professor Rick Wilford from Queen's University, who again is a very well-known political commentator and has led the Monitoring Devolution in Northern Ireland programme for a number of years, has agreed to respond to it and try to set some of the findings into the complexities of the current political situation. So I think we're very lucky to have them there. I know over the last few days I've sent both of them some emails saying this stuff's very complicated, and it is very complicated, but nobody better than them, I think, to present it in a way that we can all engage with. And after they've presented, we will then have hopefully about half an hour for questions, discussion, comment, and you're very welcome to engage with us in that. So without further ado, I'll invite Duncan to come to the podium. Thank you.
You're going to do that.
I do, yeah, if that's okay.
Good morning, and first of all, it's the very Glasgow, so try to be ready to show my failings and mistakes, and we'll notice everything. So that's part of what today is about. My job today, I think, is really just to introduce it and then to hopefully begin to stimulate some of the conversation, which will be the substance of what we have to speak about. So, where to now? Public attitudes to the long-term future of Northern Ireland, and I suppose my first job is to really just to go through some of the stuff that was found. This first graph, I suppose, plots some of the first of all, the questions and what question is asked seem to entirely change the, at least prima facie, nature of the outcome of the questions. This first diagram is actually the question here was your own national identity. Essentially, what do you regard your own national identity? And it plots actually over the full time series from 1989 the changes. And I suppose what we note in this year actually is the sharp drop after many years of rise in the number of people who are describing themselves as Northern Irish between 2010 and 2012, which also contradicts some findings of the Census, which took place in 2011. So although we can't definitively say, what we can certainly say is it appears on the basis of the data that something happened in 2012. Something happened between 2011 and 2012, which represents the sharpest single drop we've seen. In the 2010 survey, for the first time, or not the first time, second time in fact, the number of people describing themselves as Northern Irish in this survey exceeded the number of people calling themselves Irish. That has gone into reverse, and if you look at the timeline from 1989, the percentage of people calling themselves Irish has moved from roughly a quarter up to now approximately a third. So that is of its own interest. In the last year, there's been an increase in the number of people calling themselves British according to the survey, bringing it back to the level where it was in 2005 and 2006. But again, in a timeline series, if you look at this over time, in the 1980s, in the early 90s, the number of people, the percentage of people calling themselves British varied between 44 and 48%, and now in the last 5 years it's varied between 35 and 39%. So that is over time still a slightly declining figure, but what has happened in this year is that both the Irish and the British have increased. So we now look at a proportion of people responding in 2012, 39% British, 32% Irish, 22% Northern Irish. It still represents something close to a multiple minorities situation, which I suppose we have to now take seriously as well. But that the Northern Irish one appears to be possibly, and I can only say possibly at this stage, affected by events. It should be stated here that that data was gathered in the autumn of 2012. The last part of it overlapped with the flags dispute, but all of it was post the disputes around St Patrick's and parades in there. So it's in that kind of late autumn quarter that most of this took place. The second, now we'll move on to the next one. What is interesting is the degree to which the percentage describing themselves as British by religion has changed most there among Protestants and no religion. Didn't shift that much among Catholics, so it was definitely a shift within, if you like, the normal expected people who would do that, and that it's almost a reversing away from the Northern Irish identity. That's where it seems to be happening most powerfully. Among Catholics, very little change, a slight rise, but nothing that wouldn't be explicable by normal statistical variation. But where you see the actual trend figure, I suppose, where we have to see whether it's a permanent trend or simply a blip, there's certainly something happened between 2010 and 2011 among 4 Protestants. So do we speculate that people are returning to a sense of national identity which is more integral to what is traditional as a result of this? That's maybe what we can say as a result of this. Okay, maybe the next one. On the other hand, if percentage describing themselves as Irish by religion showed a similar trend, that most of that obviously was among Catholics. The percentage of no religion people describing themselves as Irish has declined theoretically or factually in terms of the results of the survey. But that's more than compensated for. And it should be also said that that represents, in our statistics, absolute equivalence. 68% of Protestants now describe themselves as British, and 68% of Catholics now describe themselves as Irish, which is a change. And the jump among the Catholics of the percentage describing themselves as Irish is from 58 to 68%. That's a significant jump in a 2-year period. So what it certainly says is that in terms of the question asked about national identity, there has been a trend towards answering that with, if you like, the more straightforward British-Irish answer than with the more complex, possibly Northern Irish answer. Okay, the percentage describing themselves as Northern Irish by religion, again, sharp drop among Catholics. There is a drop among Protestants, which is actually the weakest of the three. The number of people who describe themselves as Northern Irish has been strongest among Catholics. Again, we can speculate about that, but is it to do with, it could be, of course, still something that we have to measure, but if it has to do with events, and it certainly contradicts some of the evidence that's in the census, then we have to speculate that that identification with Northern Irishness was and is fragile and is amenable to change under the pressure of public events. Looking at other aspects of Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey over the last 20 years, which we are working out at the moment, it's extremely clear that some aspects of it are absolutely explicable in terms of emerging political events. You can track it against street controversy and problems in the political sphere, while other aspects, for example, mostly around where people want to live or where people want to send children to school, have a continuity or have had a continuity over most of 20 years. So there we can certainly say that this identity question for Northern Irish seems to be at least amenable to something going on in terms of events 2010 to 2012. So this is the so-called Marina question, where you ask people to what degree they feel that. There is, in a sense, the three groups that are up are the two at the edge and the one in the middle. The one that the options that people are given in the Marina question are Irish not British, more Irish than British, equally Irish and British, more British than Irish, British not Irish. And there's been an increase in the number of people who choose the exclusive formulation of that, Irish not British, British not Irish. And a decrease in the number of people who take the I'm a bit one but more the other. There's paradoxically been an increase and a steady increase in the number of people saying that they are equally Irish and British. So that is something which we can look at as well. And that may be also partly events driven. The comparative figure there is 2007, so we only asked that question in 2 occasions. We don't have the data for the full 20-year time, but it is an interesting question just to talk about what the context is. Okay, this, however, then, having said that, at the identity questions, we then ask people not about their national identity, but how they saw themselves in relation to traditional political labelling within Northern Ireland. And this then starts to create some of the complexity with this, because the number of people describing themselves as unionist is at a historic low. Now, some of the reason why that is, I suppose, changing the proportion of Protestants to Catholic population, so that's part. The other part of it, though, is that that's clearly happening among the Protestant community actually quite fast. That's where the over the last, certainly devolutions haven't been good for the number of people calling themselves unionists according to these figures. And it's now at 60%, which is quite sharply the lowest figure that we've ever recorded in this data. It went down to 64% in 2010, 68% in 2009, and had been at around 70% or 80% really since between 70 and 80% since 1989. So the truth is that is an interesting statistic, which is that while people seem to be saying it's the identity question, I'm British, when asked, are you a unionist, there seems to be a sharp decline in that. The number of Catholics calling themselves unionists remains at around 1%. It's essentially negligible. So while there are 9% of Catholics who call themselves British, there's only 1% of people who would call themselves unionists. So there's clearly a different understanding between support for the union and being unionist. That is something that has to be teased out, I suppose. Likewise, the percentage, but this is also strange, the number of people calling themselves nationalist has also declined among Catholics. Now, that too is on a trend, as you can see, which has continued. It's not actually the lowest figure, but it does compare with the constant figures from 1998 on, which was in the 60%. It rose very sharply in the people calling themselves nationalists between 1996 and then our figures, and then declined again, has gone into somewhat of decline in 2003. But there's definitely something going on there, a de-alignment from the question of am I a nationalist, which is not identical with the question of am I Irish. Am I Irish seems to be something which is sustained, but asked whether I'm a nationalist is something which people are less likely to identify with. Again, 1% of Protestants identify themselves in our survey as nationalists. So it is clear that while on the one hand there is a proportion of people who cross the line, there are very few who cross the line to the extent that they describe themselves in the political colours of the others. So the unionist nationalist divide appears still to be fairly denominationally aligned. On the other hand, and this is important, less than 50% of Catholics describe themselves as nationalists. Less than 50% of Catholics is around 50%, somewhere around 50%. Okay. The percentage of people asked, and we can only answer what this is an attitude survey, so we have to apply this against behaviour, of course, and what people do when they vote. In a context where 90% of the population vote on strictly nationalist unionist lines, 48% of all, 47% of all of the whole population said they were neither unionist or nationalist, and that is a historic high. That is quite clearly a historic high. In the period from 1998 to 2003, that figure never rose above 36% and fell to 25% at one stage. But it was around 30%, you could say, during that period of 35%. It's now up to 47%. That is again statistically significant. It's a jump of a quarter towards a half. So whether it's true or not, or what it means, you have to interrogate it more further. But what you certainly say is when presented with the question, do you think of yourself as nationalist or unionist, there are a large number of people now saying, I don't want to be counted in that label. We have to set that somewhere against the side of national identity. So these are figures which are moving obviously in instinctively opposite directions, and we have to answer some of those questions. But it does suggest possibly that the union is attractive, even Ireland is attractive, but that unionism and nationalism are not. That's at least one thing that might be said, and that is an interesting proposition, at least to explore. The percentage of Protestants think themselves in unionists present, again, this shows the kind of parallelism in that. This isn't something we're seeing just on one side of this equation, this is something we're seeing on the other hand. Just to, in terms of the graphics of this, to remind you of the first graph which showed you the sharp jumps at the end in terms of people identifying with national identity, these are continuing to decline. So I suppose it's just important to
meant to be at the meeting.
Here, the decline, what this leaves us with, according to these figures, is that once you take aside all voters and nationalists and unionists, is that 28% of people now think of themselves as unionist, 23% now think of themselves as nationalists, and 47% reject I'm not either a unionist or nationalist. That is double the numbers of people saying they're neither than saying themselves as nationalists, which is an interesting, at least statistic when put in the press, and we would have to speculate about what's going on there. And just to compare that, in a previous era, for 1998, for example, at that stage 40% considered themselves unionists, and 33% considered themselves neither, and 25% considered themselves nationalists. So I'd say there's definitely something going on here in terms of the way people want to describe themselves. The preferred long-term policy for Northern Ireland, and this too is an interesting statistic. To start with the obvious, there is no evidence that we're finding of a rush to United Ireland. Then that is at the same time as people appear to be polarising on national identity. That figure that we got last time was caused, I suppose, for ARK, the whole flurry around the results. It's actually confirmed. It's gone down slightly from 16 to 15%, but in statistical terms, it could probably be either of those figures. But the bottom line is we're not finding even 1/5 population now in 2 surveys, so you start to see something going on here. And just by contrast, in 2006, 30% at the end of the Celtic Tiger still thought of United Ireland as a meaningful, as their long-term policy. Now, that is interesting. However, and this is the second point, is there has been a sharp drop in the number of people who are clear that they wish to remain in the United Kingdom. From 72% to 63%, that is over the 2-year period. Now, how are we to interpret that? In some ways, we have to say this is 1-year statistics. In another way, what we also know is 14% of respondents in 2012 said they didn't know, compared with 6%. And it may be that the alienation in the context of a recession or depression in the Irish Republic and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, being in, the attractiveness of the Irish Republic is essentially not strong at the moment in Northern Ireland. At the same time, there is an alienation which might be tracking around Catholic alienation from Britishness, which is at some level rather saying we prefer to say nothing. And we can, this is a speculation, this is only speculation at this point. It is to say that it is measurable. Just to be clear again, there's no doubt that devolution is more popular by a long way than the notion of direct rule. There is a residual support for direct rule, but it is relatively small at 15% and no particular wish to go back to that. So there's another thing. Nationalism and unionism appear to be at one level not particularly popular, but at the same time there is no push whatsoever to go back to direct rule. So that also has to be said against it. Okay, that was never going to be done, it's just a question asked. And that just shows you the religion. Now clearly we said 15% of the whole population. It amounts to 32% of Catholics saying that they did prefer at some stage to go into United Ireland, but that is 32% in the context where the Catholic population or the perceived Catholic population of Northern Ireland is to about 43%, so that's a significant difference. 45. The percentage of Protestants, however, wishing United Ireland remains essentially negligible. And there's been very little ability to make that case across that line, either before or after the peace process. It doesn't seem to have certainly made it any stronger at this stage. Now, this was an interesting one. The percentage of people who think that United Ireland is likely in 20 years has fallen quite sharply from to 15% and 29%, but as ever, the percentage of Protestants who think it's going to happen is higher than the percentage of Catholics who think it's going to happen. There's a a paradox there, which is Protestants appear, Unionist politicians appear mostly to fear a plot among Catholics to be running them into United Ireland against their will. And those who are plotting appear to feel that it's very unlikely in the next 20 years. So in some sense, that's just an interesting reflection on that, is that when asked a question about whether you think it's going to happen, the people who might, at least statistically from this, fear it more, seem to think it's more likely than the people who seem to be driving for it. So there's an interesting, and we have to be clear that the big figure there is that the small percentage of people now who believe that this is in any way a realistic option. That's 15%. And that's 20, we didn't ask next year, we asked in 20 years, which is when the statistical demographic shift will move into a voter shift. All the current generation who are in the younger end will all be among voters. So that does suggest that the question of United Ireland and the border poll is, according to our statistics, not likely to succeed from a nationalist point of view in some senses. And that's another interesting point, given the strengthening of Ireland. So we have to say that the questions when asked about constitutional issues, asked about identity issues, and asked about the political allegiance issues don't add up into an immediately single construct, and we have to then ask some questions about that. Preferred long-term policy for Northern Ireland, remain in the UK by religion. Obviously, Protestants are, the majority of Protestants are there, around 90%, and that seems to be fairly standard to remain in the United Kingdom. Now that does not take into account shifts which might occur in the United Kingdom itself. It is at least thinkably possible, if not at this point immediately predictable, that the United Kingdom itself may no longer exist in its current form after 2014. However, that's not the question that's asked here. So the Unionists continue to assume the United Kingdom in some kind of continuing form. So it may be that would be where the greatest change might come, not internally rather than but externally. And certainly compared to those figures asked in Scotland, you have a far higher percentage of Northern Ireland Protestants saying they want to remain in the UK than you do of Scots currently answering that question. You possibly even have a higher percentage of Irish Catholics saying they want to remain in the United Kingdom than Scots, but that's probably an exaggeration. But the percentage of people wishing to stay showed a drop this year. That is something to know. That there appears to be an effect of events going on here. I think I'll leave that one in conclusion. There are a whole series of conclusions, most of which I've reached. I wanted to simply put a couple of speculative ideas to finish with. There may be a question here, which is that Unionist, which strikes me from my own involvement out there and also in the interpretations around the flag dispute, which is that Unionist fears translate into a fear about the Union, whereas the nationalist interpretation of the flag coming down has nothing to do with the Union at all, it just has something to do with the flag coming down, to do with symbolism. And that that Mike Nesbitt's concern, which is that it's understood in one way in one community and not in the other way, may have some validity. And I would be interested because it appears that Catholics are happy enough with the Union, but not with unionism and its symbolism. The Union that has to be there has to be a less British one, and that's a speculative interpretation, and it's my own entirely. The second one is that events, dear boy, events. That things are not, all of these questions in Northern Ireland, we ask as if they're fixed. I think they're always seen against the backdrop of the time and place in which they're asked. And so 2011 is not 2012. That's what we have to say, and so we have to look at what's been the effect of these events, and it certainly has been, the biggest one seems to me to have some kind of drop in the Catholic identification with or wish to stay within the United Kingdom without pushing them into United Ireland. And then two other points. Are these two things compatible? First of all, from a unionist point of view, the news is this. The union is safe. Unionism is not safe. Britishness is not the basis of a collective social cohesion. And that's contradicting pieces of information, but I'm putting them out there as things you can take your reason here. For nationalists, the point is here, the border is there for the foreseeable. Irish identity is not threatened by the border. And Irishness is not the basis of social cohesion either. For the moment. So I'll leave you with that as a summary of my experience of staring at these statistics for a long time. And hope that it has helped in stimulating your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, I hope all the figures are not too mind-blowing, but I think that students have done a very good job of trying to draw out some of the key findings from a very complex range of data over a long number of years. And certainly we can come back and clarify any queries you have about that. But now I'm going to invite Wilford to just respond to some of Duncan's statements and ideas. Do you want to speak here? So
I had a car accident recently. My back is really sore, so I'll remain.
Okay, can you get him?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. The difficulty with coming second, of course, is you don't get still all that's right. I identified at least some of the key questions as well as some of the key trends. So I'm not going to read the figures. Well, a lot of detail anyway, but I think probably what I'll end up doing is underlining some of the points that Duncan's already made, and I hope that's not going to be too dull for you. I mean, things stood out for me were, first of all, the stiffening, if you like, of mutually exclusive national identities among both Protestants and Catholics, particularly apparent since St Andrews, I think, in 2006, and then the reintroduction of devolution in 2007. And also, interestingly enough, I think a hardening of British identity amongst those with no religion in Northern Ireland. That seems to have stiffened too. But it's that rate, I think, of change of national identity, which is quite interesting, because since 2010, among Catholics, the increase in the percentage of proportion who identified as Irish has gone up by 10% in 2 years, and that's really quite a startling increase. Equally, among Protestants, the proportion identifying as British increased by 8% within the 2 year period. Now, as Duncan has already said, there's a whole, one has to think about context and about the kinds of events that were actually occurring within Northern Ireland at the time. And we'll remember that there's some duality and certainly some tension about between the DUP and Sinn Féin, particularly during 2007-11 period at Stormont and within the executive. And I wonder whether that might be one of the background factors that has helped to explain this apparent increase in how people feel about themselves nationally. Now, just to reinforce the point, and it's a point that Duncan made earlier in his presentation, given that the bulk of the fieldwork was completed before the flags protest kicked off, particularly here in Belfast, but not exclusively, this hardening of identity suggests that there were more underlying causes to explain this kind of growth, in a sense, of mutually exclusive identities, national identities between Protestants and Catholics. It may well be that Protestants increasingly came to understand what was going on in Northern Ireland as a kind of proxy cultural war between Protestants and Catholics. It may have been a difficult period of DUP Sinn Féin relations actually in the wake of the Assembly elections. And there were moments, and if you remember earlier this year, McGuinness and Robinson had to be together as they were trying to patch up their relationship in a kind of no-holds-barred conversation that they both had. But I think that sense of tension probably has informed, certainly among Protestants, a concern that they need to reassert their national identity, even though there is no threat. So you could argue that this is an exercise in paranoia, really, amongst unionists, that they need to cleave to a British identity when, in fact, notions of Britishness are fluid. They're fluid not least because of the prospect of a referendum, or the actuality of a referendum next year in Scotland, although I don't think it's going to go the way, but But what is, at a time when Britishness itself is confused, I think it's confusing, that it's not a kind of crystalline identity, that more Protestants are cleaving to that identity is a bit of a puzzle. You know, this is not a static, phenomenal British national identity. It's fluid. Another may be that, and this was certainly something that was apparent if you go back and have a look at notes 98-9, that period, when the deal had been struck over the Good Friday Agreement. And initially there was a kind of almost euphoric belief that Unionists and Nationalists were going to gain equally from the product of the agreement. So there were a symmetry in terms of outcomes for each national community. But in fact, quite quickly that changed among Protestants and Unionists. That increasingly they, instead of seeing this as a kind of win-win equation, they increasingly came to see it as a kind of win-lose situation. And that was fueled by arguments about decommissioning and prisoner releases and reform of the analyses. And that kind of initial symmetry changed quite quickly, actually, at the beginning, to a kind of asymmetric relationship, the Protestants believing that they were losing more than they were gaining. Certainly they were losing more than what they perceived the Catholic community to be gaining in Northern Ireland. And one wonders whether to some extent that might linger in the minds of some Protestants and some Unionists, that overall this has been a bit of a loss. There also, of course, was controversy over Medicare cash and all the stuff about this is going to be a shrine to terrorism, claimed by certainly some of the LGBT people. And again, that may have been a factor, and it's purely speculative. I've only seen the headline data. I haven't had the opportunity to look at it in more depth. But also perhaps the failure of our politicians, our political classes, to articulate clearly, until very, very recently, the parameters of a shared future in Northern Ireland. And that perhaps has unsettled some within the wider population. And one of the consequences has been this across-the-board decline in people defining or describing themselves as Northern Irish. Although I remember in my own mind being quite clear what actually that kind of mosaic of a Northern Irish identity actually consists of. It's not British, it's not Irish, it's some kind of, as it were, intermediate identity. It's not Ulster. It's much more than that, but I'm not quite sure exactly what the comparing parts of it are. But that disdaining of the Northern Irish identity has become especially evident among Catholics in Northern Ireland. Since 2010, it's down 9%, so naturally got a startling drop. Now this may not, on the one hand, be good news for Messrs McAllister and McRae, who later today, of course, are launching their new political committee, from which they've seriously got the label unionist. In some years it's going to be called NI21, which is Northern Ireland for the 21st century. But the appeal of little Northern Irelandism on these measures seems to be diminishing. Okay. And the beneficiaries of that have been hard on strengthening the attitudes of nationalism. People who are more likely to claim Northern Ireland identity are those with no religious affiliation, followed distantly, relatively speaking, by Protestants and then finally Catholics. So it seems to be a diminishing group within the population who are laying claim to that particular identity, even though, to my mind, it's not a fully articulated identity. But we have an apparent paradox. While national identities seem to have strengthened, communal identities seem to have weakened. I think Duncan said among Protestants, the proportion identifying as unionist has declined to the lowest proportion since Milt, as it were, was hatched. It's 10 points lower in 2012 than it was in 2007, when the evolution was restored as semantics. More than 1 in 3 of them define themselves as unionists in the national 46%. The finding for Catholics, I think, is even more compelling. 49% identify as nationalists, but 48% say they are neither nationalists nor unionists. Now that's a very vivid expression, it seems to me, of a split communal personality within the Catholic population. And overall, almost half the population, 47%, disavow those kind of communal identities. Now, among other things, what I might do is lend momentum to policy efforts to forge a shared future in the community. If there is a growing detachment from these kind of monolithic, all-embracing, homogeneous notions of identity and communal identity. And maybe that opportunity needs to be shared not just fully, but actually aggressively. One thing is abundantly clear from the findings that Duncan and so ably demonstrated, is that there is nothing in these results to encourage the Secretary of State to contemplate, let alone prepare for, a border. There is nothing here, as it were, that those who seek Irish unification and as it were seize on in order to advance their campaign. And we know Sinn Féin has kicked off the conversation about moves towards border poll within the space of the term of the next assembly. That's their current ambition. But on this issue, they seem to be pushing against the grain of public opinion. There is just no climate demand for Irish unification. There isn't. Even though the Protestants are slightly more apprehensive about the prospect than Catholics. I mean, the demand simply isn't there. So it seems to me that the calls for, or the movement towards trying to stimulate demand for the is falling on largely deaf ears. Now, of course, let's assume that next year the Scots vote for independence. Possible, unlikely, but it's possible. That would mean, of course, a number of things, not the least of which is that it would unsettle unionists even more if that were to happen. And that could create a context which gives some momentum to the call for border poll here. It's no surprise that Peter Robinson has been really quite keen to add his 3 pence to the debate in Scotland as a feature of Scotland within the Union. And of course, Sinn Féin's position has always been, well, this is a matter for the Scottish people to decide, and they stay out of the debate. But Robinson has been quite insistent on lending his voice to the pro-union campaign in Scotland. Warts and all, and while imperfect and notwithstanding the strength of national identity, devolution looks certainly to be the settled arrangement of the future. One of the concerns here, of course, is that we know since 1998 that electoral turnout in Northern Ireland has trended consistently downwards. It's fallen ever since the first assembly in 1998. Fell to high 60s in 2003, low 60s in 2007, and it fell to about 54% last year in 2011. So you've got this kind of parting of national identity going on, apparent disavowal of communal identities by both Protestants and Catholics, and yet we know that fewer and fewer people are being motivated to actually turn up to the polling booths on election day. And our next election day will be now in 2016, not 2015, given the legislation that's currently going through Westminster. Is that a worry? Well, it is a worry, I suppose, in the sense that I'm not sure quite exactly what explains the disengagement. Some people are complacent enough to believe it's because devolution is performing rather well, others because it's performing really badly, and others because there's quite a great deal of electoral apathy. And the task of actually re-engaging people in the political process is something I think which is a challenge for all of us. And maybe policies which are designed to capitalise on what appear to be shifting social attitudes or communal attitudes in Northern Ireland should give the, some impetus to a view that actually there is a great opportunity space for policies that are determinately and unapologetically responding to this changing kind of kaleidoscopic notion of identity. I do find this decline in communal identity really quite, well, on the one hand puzzling, but on the other one encouraging. Because it seems to me that what this is suggesting is that people are searching for alternatives. They're not quite sure what the alternative is. It doesn't appear to be Northern Irish nurse, whatever that is. But it's something other than being popped conveniently into one communal box or another. This, perhaps, unlike the declining Northern Irishism, the fact that this siege, this loosening of communal identity, that might give some succor, not only to McRae and McAllister, but also perhaps the Alliance, because people seem to want an alternative. The prospect of getting them to the polling booth, to turn out to vote at the next Assembly election, I mean, if the current trends continue, I mean, this could fall below 50%. And we have the lowest turnout in the UK at the general election as well. We were the only part of the UK where it fell below 60%. So there is a distinct, now is that anti-politics? Is it anti-politician? Is it a combination of both? Or is it just a kind of recognition among many people here in Northern Ireland that actually what they're content with is what passes for peace, or at least the absence of acute or even chronic bouts of violence in Northern Ireland? It's a real issue there, I think, for the parties. And also for the political institutions. I mean, the Assembly itself did quite a lot, particularly post-2007, to try and promote engagement with the wider electorate and the wider public in Northern Ireland. We do have a problem of engagement. It's by no means unique to Northern Ireland. It seems to be a chronic and generic problem for political institutions. But it is alarmingly low level of engagement, particularly amongst young people, first-time voters in Northern Ireland. So there is a challenge for the parties in that. Now, this loosening of communal identity, particularly, especially amongst Catholics, might encourage Peter Robinson, to act on what he said at his party conference during his party conference speech, which is kind of reach out to Catholics in order to recruit them into the DUP fold. Well, that's an appeal which I think will fall largely on deaf ears. Don't see that we were reaping any particular dividends. But one area where it might have an effect is on the reform of the political institutions themselves. Over the last year or more now, the Assembly and Executive Review Committee of the Assembly has been looking at architectural and procedural prospective reforms of both the Assembly and the Executive. They've looked at, for example, ideas concerning decoupling Northern Ireland's Assembly seats from Westminster seats, which has already been accomplished in both Scotland and Wales. So they're not they've looked at provision of an opposition, formal opposition. Something which McAllister has as the topic of subject of the Parliament Members' Bill, which shall be tabled in the Assembly. We're looking at the hunt. Now, but the one area that seems to have potential for influencing the thinking of politicians in relation to this reform agenda is that weakening of communal designation at large within the Because one of the issues that the politicians in the committee will be looking at is whether or not to abandon communal designation within the Assembly, which is required primarily, as it were, as a test of full community consent. Although, of course, that issue has been complicated by the rather cavalier way in which politicians have used the position of concern devices to expedite a number of issues for which that device was never actually intended. But this weakening of communal identity doesn't yet seem to have conveyed itself or communicated itself to politicians in the Assembly, because they could abandon communal It seems that politicians have no existential doubts about their own communal recognition, but yet increasing proportions of the population and the electorate do. And it may well be that this finding in particular, although it could well be a contingent finding, could actually influence the debate over the sorts of reforms that might be undertaken within the Assembly itself, so that they could abandon with some confidence the communal recognition requirement and actually instead opt for something like weighted majority voting on issues, rather than, as it were, counting heads inside ethnic boxes, which seem to be much more open boxes. They're not tightly sealed anymore, they're much more permeable, and I think that would be an advance. It would represent a way that the political classes here in Northern Ireland could actually respond to what seems to be a weakening of those communal associations within Northern Ireland. And I'll stop there.
Okay, we've had some very interesting responses from from Rick, and I think Rick has re-emphasised some of the points Duncan made, but also challenged us to think about some of the policy implications and the political structures that may be impacted on by some of these findings. You've been quite right. You want to just stand up and shake if we sit down and start asking some questions, or move around it for a minute. I know some people need to do that. Yeah, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, and then some questions. Okay. I know there's probably quite a few different questions and points to be made. So, if you're agreeable, I'll take 2 or 3 points first, just so that we don't get tied up on one particular issue. So, anybody like to make a comment, or it doesn't have to be a full-blown question, just a comment to start us off, or observations? Yes?
I don't know if there has been any research done, but you mentioned about the identity of being Northern Irish. But has there been research into that to say what exactly it does mean to different people about being from Northern Ireland or Northern Irish?
Okay, we'll keep that one. Any other comments? Yes, Derek?
The question on national identity, about unionists or nationalists, were people prompted as to what that meant? Because it could mean communal identity or broadly unionist or nationalist, or could be political identity. Is it support for unionist parties or nationalist parties?
Okay.
So were people prompted as to?
Paul, do you remember the question off the top of your head?
No, I would think we tend to ask the questions in one of two ways. Often it would be a very straightforward thing of how do you think best describes you. And I think for the Irish, Northern Irish thing, as you can see, sorry, you had it there on the slide. That one? Oh no, that's a different one, sorry. But I think for the unionist nationalist, like do you see yourself as unionist nationalist or neither? And then perhaps for the national identity one, I think it's just what do you best describes you, and then there's a show card with the response options on it. But to be honest, I'm saying this off the top of my head, so it could be proved wrong. But as Gillian said, all the results with the exact wording and the questionnaires are up on the website, so probably better to look at that. But we wouldn't have said any more than a very straightforward question. We would certainly doesn't go into a lot of descriptions, so that people aren't prompted.
Okay, thank you. Sheila, did you want? Okay. Sorry, did you?
Just along the same lines, and the question you had referred to unionist and nationalist as communal identity, and it struck me that seemed to assume a shared understanding of what was done to unity.
And do we have one more? Yes.
You discussed findings on political party affiliation or support. I don't know if you know that, but were any of these changes you found, shifts in how people say and vote?
Can I just answer that? Because the Life Times data just became available on Tuesday, so we've really only been able to look at the headline figures and present those to you today. The data is all on the website, and obviously many people will be doing different sorts of analysis, but we didn't have time to get into the complexities of political party voting. Sorry, Paul.
Can I just say on that as well that in the survey we do ask about political party affiliation, and that isn't the same as how people vote. And as Rick raised, about half the population don't vote. So there's a lot of discussion often about how the survey results may or may not reflect electoral results, but I think it's just to remember that there are two things. One, it's about political party affiliation. People vote in different ways. They sometimes vote for tactically, whatever. And also, I suppose, third thing is to remember that a lot of people don't vote. So it's just to remember that. But again, that's not the party affiliation question. It's on the website.
But did you ask people if they do vote? No.
Not this year.
Not this year, because
that's another thing.
there's always a limited space on the surveys in terms of how much you can get into, and voting is a complicated thing to ask about last election, usually very things like that. So the question about being Northern Irish is one I think we could perhaps ask Duncan and Rick to speak about. For me, one of the interesting things was that a few years ago, probably we were beginning to report from the trends and the findings was an increase in people just choosing to identify as Northern Irish rather than Irish or British. And now we find that trend beginning to reverse. So to me, that's sort of a simplified, non-political scientist view of that. So maybe Duncan or Rick, you want to say something more on that?
I do want to say something about that because the more interesting measure is two things. One, the trend figure, which was up in its question right up to 2010. The census confirmed it, and now you're going down the chute. And
It may be a blip.
but no, and the really significant one is the drop among Protestants was from 29% calling themselves Northern Irish in 2010 to 24%. Not exactly within experimental error, but it is a kind of a more normative thing. Among Catholics, it fell from 26%, where it had been kind of rising towards. And then the previous just to that was 29% Protestant, 26% Catholic was within that Northern Irish identity. So almost equal. It's gone down to 24% Protestant, 17% Catholic. Something happened to those people who, Catholics who were previously considering themselves Northern Irish last year. Now, there is a negative side to that, which is the political environment was becoming tense towards the end of the year, and we don't know what that was because and it would be interesting to know the long effect of flags, protests and all of these things, which I don't think we're in a position to talk about here yet at all. However, it was also the Jubilee. It was a strong feeling of a particular British identity. There may be issues that are affecting it from that side, which is the Britishness was defined in a certain type of a way for people. I don't know. And Northern Irishness, an alienation in there. I'm entirely speculating, but all we can say for definite is that this is not so much diminishing as a fall. This is not a question of a kind of long-term graph which is just slowly going down in one direction. It's going up and then it goes like that. So that is an interesting phenomenon, and also the question that has in proportionality of what Northern Irishness means. I think so. The two things I would say about that identity are: one, the content of that may depend on the proportions of Catholics and Protestants who are coming to it, and that may mean that it is incredibly fluid and fragile, and so there would be something to drive into that. Because in some ways, the big headline out of the census last year was the high proportion of Catholics and the almost equal proportions between Catholics and Protestants who were describing themselves as Northern Irish. So it was not that was interesting. It wasn't a kind of a Northern Ireland football team identity. It was a identity that people from different parts of the community were buying into. And the second one is that it is extremely fragile. That's what I would take from this, is that it is it's not fixed. It's both fluid. Its content objectively has to be challenged all the time, but also it is also vulnerable to potential shocks, because what it means may be depending on how people are experiencing it on the street, and what it means for them. So I don't know, there may be more to that you can also think about, because these are just things Dom and Rick certainly may have other ideas.
Well, no, I'm not aware of any particular piece it referred to it as kind of unpacked, this mosaic of Northern Irishness. But to pick up on one of the points that Duncan made, yes, there was this, the Jubilee and all the rest of it. There was also, of course, the Queen's visit to Ireland, which was kind of previously, which is signally and symbolically really quite important, which made people perhaps on the one hand proud to feel British, and on the other feeling as it were proud to be Irish because we had, the sovereign as it were visiting the Republic of Ireland for the first time in goodness knows when ever, I think, and that maybe added some kind of legitimacy to this notion of Irishness. It's the contingency of those events, I think, that shaped this. And I do agree with Duncan, though, that whatever comprises Northern Irishness, it certainly, although it's declined, and it could well just be a blip, rather than, as it were, the beginning of a trend. I don't necessarily think it is. But whatever it is, it seems to be malleable. But the fact is, 1 in 5 still claim to be Northern Irish. And that's a significant group within the wider population. It's not 1 in 10, it's not 1 in 5. 1 in 20, it's 1 in 5. And that's, potentially electorally significant. So what we don't know, and the question that was posed was, whether those kinds of people are the ones who are more likely to vote when, a significant minority of people are not bothering to vote. So it's actually who is mobilising who. And we know that just as the demographics overall are converging in Northern Ireland between Protestants and Catholics, in terms of electoral behaviour, voting patterns are also converging in the sense that probably 43 or 4% of the first preference votes in 2011 went to Unionist parties, about 42% went to Irish and Fenian of the SLP. So there is the demographic convergence, there's a kind of electoral convergence occurring at a time when people seem to be less secure in their communal identity and more secure in their national identity. So the latter are mutually exclusive, the former are potentially inclusive. Even though we're not entirely sure what Northern Irishness is. Maybe that's something that deserves not only academic attention, but also, as it were, should be something that concentrates the minds of some of our political parties, because potentially there could be a vote out there that some political parties can seem to attract and mobilize.
Okay. If you want to come back on the Unionist Nationalist blurring between the as we presented on the question?
Yeah, I mean, the questions that specifically asked, I was looking at that. The question is asked was, generally speaking, do you think of yourself as a Unionist, a Nationalist, or neither? That was the question that was asked. And the question on national identity was, which of these best describes the way you think of yourself? British, Irish, Ulster, or Northern Irish? That was the question. Just to say, the Ulster seems to have fallen right off the table now. It was something which meant something in the 1990s still, but it seems to have got lost between the 926 county boundary and the Unionist use of it and the Nationalist use of it, and the difference. So Northern Irishness seems to have definitely much more resonance now than the word Ulster. So it's 6, not 9, that people are being asked about there. But that's the question that was asked. So it was a kind of a general summing yourself up, and so it's quite interesting that so many people say, "Oh, I'm British," if I'm asked about that, or Irish, but that and how that translates into political preference for and how people think themselves. This fluidity around this stuff. I mean, it is interesting to speculate on what is it? Is it non-voters? Is it people? Is it that the reason that the SDLP and the Ulster Unionist Party have had such a hard time is that they keep competing on the issue of nationalism and unionism, and their voters are the very people who are telling them that is not what we're interested in anymore? That's an interesting question. Is it that they that people seem to be able to say two things? Being British and being Irish is certainly not translated into people saying, and my long-term future within the United Kingdom or within Ireland. There's no direct association at the moment between that at all that we can find. And then also also they seem to be saying, and this is what I was trying to put, which is it appears as though people are British or Irish, but not that happy with the political representation of those things, unionism and nationalism, and that's quite interesting.
But I wonder, Duncan, I mean, when we look at them, we do tend to interpret in terms of our local terms of reference. Was this occasioned by the flags dispute or the St. Patrick's Cathedral thing or whatever? But I wonder if we open it out, might it help explain some of the apparent contradictions in it? In that what we see here, I think, the main dichotomy is that between the strengthening of national identities and a weakening of political identities. And might that connect up to a kind of weakening of faith in political projects? You know, if we were to try to relate this to what's happening, say, in the UK, to the weakening of faith in the efficacy of traditional political parties to solve the problems in a globalized world, that people no longer actually have that faith, though on voting day they may still tend to, by default, go back to traditional parties, but without the same conviction. Might that help explain some of it?
Well, it's certainly the case overall that people have de-aligned from political parties, and party membership figures are lowest, I think, in recent recorded history. The people are not engaging. And I said earlier on, that disengagement is not just an issue for us. I think it's a difference of scale, but it's not a difference in kind. I mean, the problem seems to be a generic one. But in terms of projects, I mean, I think one of the projects that should give some political leaders pause for thought is unionist unification, or ideas about unionist forum. Even the idea of a single unionist party. I mean, I think that would be counterintuitive in terms of actually what these results disclose. I mean, I think it would be a bad move. And I think there are distinctive pieces of electoral ground that unionist parties, as it were, can identify and define, and I'm including in the articles. The one is about to be launched in the last time. And it's always a signal day for the designers with a new party appears, unless it's UKIP, of course. But I think it does give us pause for thought. I think there's, one of the, it struck me that one of the kind of, over the longer haul, one of the disappointments, if you will, with evolution is that when we got it back in formally at the end of 1999, 18 months or so after the election, delays, you know the reasons for that. But that was a time when the UK government then was bristled with public spending plans. The Keynesians were running the Treasury. And there was a great opportunity for infrastructure development, all the rest of it. And here we were with our new devolved institutions, tottering, teetering. Nobody really believing that First Assembly stroke executive was going to survive. Then we had 4.5 years of direct rural reinstitution. We come back in 2007, just as the financial crisis. Then we have this austerity government. So that our cultural attitudes seem to be, or identifiers seem to be changing at a time when public spending is in incredibly short supply. And what that does is it kind of bridles or diminishes the prospect for, as it were, investing significantly in order to encourage the view generally that a devolved Northern Ireland is working and working effectively. That had things been different, they weren't, but had the project then, the devolution project, been accompanied by, as it were, control over the block grants and strategic, as it were, direction over investment and making Northern Ireland, a place within which there was rising employment and all the rest of it, and that standards of living generally were increasing. Now, paradoxically, we have a situation where communal identities seem to be fraying, where the belt is tightening, so that any kind of largesse to foster a sense of Northern Ireland having a shared future is actually jeopardised to some extent by the shortage of resources, and that could be a worry.
I want to take up your point, because I actually think it's a very interesting point, which is that people's identity don't expect it anymore to be delivered by political projects. And British and Irish, and actually, which is an interesting point for nationalism in a very general sense, if you're thinking politically, which is that the 19th century claim was for nations to survive, you needed to run the state. You needed to have a state in your own image. That was the claim of the 19th century. And it may be coming to an end here, which is people are saying, actually that's less relevant to me. I need something which gives me my British and Irishness back, but I don't need it. I don't need actually the state to be something which reflects or mirrors me back. And that is an interesting potential idea. The other interesting question coming out of this, of course, is, okay, you have this, but in the voting terms, you're not, they're either not voting or they're continuing to vote. Actually, it's the fact of themselves, they don't think of themselves as unionists and nationalists, they actually are. Yeah. Now, that may be partly explicable by cultural habit, in other words, by the fact that actually when you're voting unionists and nationalists, some people are voting for a cultural or a constitutional ideal. I remember talking to somebody in Portland saying, I can't vote for anybody else because nobody else can deliver around here. I have to vote for these people because only certain parties, if I live in a nationalist part of town, there really only are two parties who can deliver me anything. And so I have only that choice actually sitting here. So if you're thinking delivery politics, people are forced by segregation to only vote for the parties which can deliver to them. So there's a kind of structural thing that operates here. And then the third one is, people vote against things, not for things. Large numbers of people may be, I'm not nationalist unionist, but hate those ones. I'm more anti-nationalist, not nationalist and unionist, and I'm an anti-unionist. So I'm asking, it's the other ones happen to get in. I don't care who gets in, but I do care they don't get in.
Well,
so,
yeah, on that last point, I mean, if you go back and have a look at the campaign that the DUP ran in 2011, one of the strap lines was, you know, do you want Martin McGuinness as First Minister?
Yeah.
So I suppose to the extent, I think we can probably only ever say the communal identification is weakened when, not just the electorate as a whole, but political leaderships in unionist parties can actively contemplate a Sinn Féin First Minister with a unionist deputy First Minister. There could be four worlds. But Peter Robinson, the DUP's line was, unless you stump up and vote for the DUP, we're the only party that could prevent Martin McGuinness from becoming First Minister. So there is still that card, which is that electoral card, which is played. So that maybe some people are being pulled out of, as it were, the default position, as it were, or, inertial position, in the sense that they seem to be disassociating from communal labor. But actually, when it comes to an election, the spring, as it were, recoils back into shape. And that's a card that politicians will deploy, and the DUP did deploy. So it becomes a kind of proxy referendum on who's First Minister.
Okay, we have time just for one or two last comments if there are any. Yes.
Could you not give a positive spin on things and say that? But you can say that the results, I mean, effectively it is apathy. Maybe that we're getting as apathetic and disenfranchised as everywhere else in the world. You know, that's kind of like a normalization of politics. And you could say that that's positive because people are this, the little trouble thing, Irish, British. They just want to get on with their lives and frankly, stay the hell away from politics.
Yeah.
Especially in Northern Ireland, where let's face it, it's like that old anarchist saying, no matter who you vote for, the government always gets in. I mean, really, we've got this Sinn Féin DUP for life, essentially. So you can see how people just kind of give up a little bit, and it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Is there any other final comments? Yes,
I think what you two were saying about towards the end there about anti-voting or voting against, it does seem to have been borne out by turnout maybe in the last election across different constituencies, and even as far back as 1998, like from Analysed to Rome, it's always a real race, either for the first place or for in Westminster elections who gets in. But if you compare like from Analysed to Rome, which was relatively high in the last Assembly election, to the other constituencies, to somewhere like North Down or Stratford, or somewhere where 5 unionists and 1 alliance or 6 unionists were going to get in come hell or high water, you know. Turnout was, I think, 40% in Southdown and similar in Strangford. So I think that it is borne out by the turnout in the last few elections.
So final comments?
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, the differential turnouts matter a lot, and there's certain complacency, if you like, in the east of the province, and people who are not turning out the unionists, and I know that Bladwell McLean and Alistair were trying to sweet talk the Soviet Union into coming out here to give themselves that cachet of having a sitting MP and so on. I think he's resisted all brandishments because too secure. Anyway, but you're right, but that's a challenge, I think, for unions in particular, is to mobilise that electorate, which was greater for you always called the garden centre union, the ones who actually seem less likely to develop, particularly.
You may see the rise of the garden centre nationalists as well. I mean,
well, true.
The two things that, I mean, there is something which says, you know, the government always gets in, so there's an alienation from. There is a risk in that, of course, which is that politics goes on anyway, and therefore the control of resources becomes essentially corrupt because it is done by a permanent government without an opposition, and it is simply given out to, and that happens anyway, no matter what number turn out, and that actually what happens is the entire political system then operates around what it thinks is the most important issue, which is flags, and you get a massive polarisation to extremism. So I mean, I'm not pessimistic about these things. I think they're interesting. I think it suggests what, I mean, there's something interesting here, which is theoretically only, and I don't actually believe it's, but I'll punt it anyway, is that Martin McGuinness would make more votes if he would vote to secure the union. You know, I mean, but that, and which might be what he has to do, in fact, if he becomes First Minister in practice. But because that's actually what people are telling. But is it what we want you to do? We see our long-term future in the United Kingdom are voting for you, so you have to deliver them. Interesting phenomenon. But this potential that the space is left for a dialogue which people are not voting positively to end, but voting negatively to end. In other words, not participating to end, is at least something which political science needs to look at, is what is the nature of that phenomenon. Because it could be that it's the precursor to a totally new form of politics, and it's just for somebody to actually go into the market and stimulate that and to find out what it is. On the other hand, it could be that what it does is leave the actual space being run by the people who do still get in, and the people who do still get in are playing to particular ends and to the securing particular use. So that is, for Northern Ireland, I think, given the absence of opposition currently, and I think Rick's point, which is, you know, it would be interesting to see if this would have any impact on that question of designation. Because the designation issue is the keystone of the current arrangement. And if designation was to go, and it essentially means the political parties agree at some level or other there's an advantage to them in that, and I still don't know what that is for the current political parties, and I can't see it, which is why I can't see why it's going to go. But it certainly suggests here that the population wouldn't be your obstacle to that. The obstacle to that is the current interest of the political parties in the present system. The population itself is relatively indifferent to that question. They need to, and isn't really attached to them.
Yeah, I just on the point about I'm Welsh and we're melancholic by disposition, so I'm more on the E, or we're definitely
Tigger.
It's more Tigger. But I tell you, communal designation, I think, is part of another project I think which needs to be developed, and that is for our 108 MLAs to act as parliamentarians. And opposition might be one device for doing that. But if you look for backbench, as it were, dissent in the Assembly, there isn't any. These parties are incredibly tightly whipped. There is a reluctance amongst our MLAs, as it were, to assert their relative autonomy or independence by bucking against party managers and the business managers in the Assembly. And I think that actually has something of a deadening effect on the way in which the Assembly in particular is perceived. that these are party animals. They're not, as I've used the phrase before, committee creatures, in the sense of where they assert that separate, distinctive identity as committee members stroke parliamentarians. So I think that the institutional culture, or our political culture, needs to change. But it's up to the members themselves to assert that relative independence and relative autonomy. And to say to the party whip, sorry, actually on this issue I don't agree and I'm going into the other law. But I can tell you that the parties up there are, I think, the most heavily whipped political parties I've ever encountered. They really are. Well, there beside. But, well, now that the Basil and St John have gone, McNary, I think yes. And the UUP, of course, always had a problem with some members right from the first. But that aside, I mean, there is so, the notion of a parliamentary culture becoming embedded in the assembly is something I think that is a challenge which still exists. So on that basis, I'm pessimistic.
Okay, well, I'm going to draw the seminar to a close now, just with a few thanks. Firstly, I should thank at the beginning the people who respond to the survey. The survey has been running for a long number of years, and every year we find people who are willing to take time to share their views with us.